Welcome, everybody. Welcome again to another edition of the History Sit Down, where I, Nathan Amin, sit down with authors in the history arena who I think have written very interesting books and do have, interesting things to say about history. Many of you will have joined previous editions of this, where I've spoken with people like Lucy Worsley, Nicola Tallis, and other historians. Tonight, I am delighted to be joined by Richard Anderton. Richard is a writer from the north of England, which we'll have to speak about that in a minute, who has a passion for history. In addition to his latest work, which we'll come to plenty throughout this discussion, Richard has previously written quite a few books on historical fiction, as well as for a variety of magazines. The book that he's written most recently came out today. It is called The Last Yorkists, and it is a biography of the De La Poole family. But I'm sure we can get Richard to talk more about that in a bit. So first and foremost, welcome, Richard, to the History Sit Down. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you so much for asking me to join in. It's a great honour. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Whereabouts in the north of England are you based?
Up in the northeast, heading towards the Scottish border.
Ah, right, Northumberland, the
Northumberland,
frontier
exactly.
zone. Yeah. I love Northumberland. That's probably my favourite part of England, to be honest. Which I got to explore a lot while writing my House of Beaufort book, because it features very big, of course, in the Wars of the Roses. So I guess, first of all, I've given just a brief introduction to who you are. But for the rest of us, why don't we do it in your words? Introduce yourself. Tell us all about you. Tell us about your history journey.
Well, so I suppose, particularly the Wars of the Roses, like to say I'm a proud Northumbrian, but I was actually born in Yorkshire, just a few hundred yards away from Sandal Castle, where, of course, Richard of York, 3rd Duke of York, met his rather untimely end at the Battle of Wakefield. And it just so obviously I'm called Richard, the Sandal, and both my parents are proud Lancastrians. So I guess I'm a bit of a Tudor, really, because I'm a blend of both. So always had a fact.
It's of course a very funny thing, isn't it, that people always think today, the white rose and the red rose, it's Yorkshire versus Lancashire, and of course that wasn't really how the Wars of the Roses itself played out. Yorkshire was proud Lancaster country for a vast majority of the 15th century. Of course, Richard III, this is going to get into yet another Richard III bashing maybe from me, but there is this big thing done about the connection that Yorkshire had with Richard III. I lived in York for 8 years, and I think what people have misunderstood, is that Yorkshire came around to Richard because of his Neville connections. It's still got nothing to do with the House of York. It's the Neville connection, I think, that Richard was able to make use of. But anyway, beautiful part of the country. There's a lot of history for you to have grown up watching, observing, and I guess inspiring you.
Very, very much so. And then, we actually moved up to Northumberland when I was very, very small. But, sort of growing up not far from Hadrian's Wall and this sort of thing, throw a brick in any direction, you'll hit something historical. So it's always been part of my life. But I've never really, I've never been a professional historian as such. I mean, I started my working life in the legal profession, and when that didn't work out particularly, I turned to writing, and I've been very lucky that I've been able to, put some food on the table through writing. So,
well, I would argue that you've now written a professionally published trade book. That does make you a professional historian.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
That's very kind.
Okay,
Um,
so
uh,
let's talk about our new book then. Um, this is, I believe this is your first non-fiction narrative offering.
yes,
You've written historical fiction, which we can talk about as well. It's called The Last Yorkists. Like I say, it
yeah,
is out today, and it tells what I think is a remarkable story of, well, the De La Poole family, particularly Edmund De La Poole and um, Richard De La Poole. I was fortunate enough to be given a advanced copy to read. I have read the book. I did genuinely enjoy it. I found it
thank
quite
you.
um, objective, which is very difficult to do with this subject.
Yeah,
And this is what I wrote as my endorsement of your book. A vivid and masterful exploration of the Tudors' draining struggle to overcome the spectre of the White Rose. An essential, balanced, and thrilling read. So,
uh,
with that being said, I endorse it. Tell me, Richard, um, who are the De La Pools? Why are they
so
important?
so in a nutshell, that they are the last, because the book is specifically about Edmund and Richard, and who are the youngest sons of the John de la Pole, the second Duke of Suffolk, and the other John de la Pole, who was mixed up with a Simnel rebellion. That was their eldest brother. But so they're all nephews of Richard III, and it's again the where they come from is a remarkable tale in itself, because they're actually in the historical record back in the late 1200s is wool merchants, Yorkshire wool merchants from the wonderfully named Ravensworth, which was this lost town on the Humber estuary that sort of sank into the North Sea. But they made a huge fortune through the wool trade. And then they made another fortune by lending money to the crown. And so Edward II, Edward III, all their wars were financed by the De La Poles. And they gradually climbed the sort of ladder of the Plantagenet court and made enemies along the way. This is in the 1300s. And Michael de la Pole, he managed to make himself first Earl of Tufton. And he has the dubious distinction of being the first um, uh, minister of the crown to be impeached. And needless to say, all his enemies blamed him for being. This was under Richard II, and of course Richard II had a huge court of favourites, and it's alienated. For example, Henry Bolingbroke, the founder of the House of Lancaster, was one of the people who wanted to get rid of Richard II's favourites, and the Michael was impeached. He fled into exile, but his son, Michael II, he managed to win back all the family estates and title just when Bolingbroke lands to start his own revolution that goes Richard II. And but Michael manages to convince Bolingbroke that he's a loyal Lancastrian. And this is the most remarkable thing about the De La Poles, who end up being the last Yorkists. They're also the first Lancastrians in many respects. And so you had Michael the second joining Henry V in the Agincourt campaign. And unfortunately, he catches dysentery at the siege of Harfleur and dies. So his son, also called Michael, uh, is briefly third Earl. He's one of the few Englishmen to be killed at Agincourt. So his brother becomes the fourth Earl of Suffolk. And this is Edmund and Richard's grandfather talking about now, William de la Pole. And he's one of the great figures of the middle of the 15th century. He's fought in the Agincourt campaign. He then becomes a military commander in Henry V's and Henry VI's wars to hang on to France, the final phases of the Hundred Years' War. William de la Pole is one of the leading figures, and he becomes, but he's utterly humiliated by Joan of Arc. He's uh, uh, he's in command of the English force at the siege of Orleans, after Salisbury, I think, is killed, and Joan of Arc, forces him to raise the siege, and because of that, I mean, obviously, I'm oversimplifying the situation greatly, but William de la Pole becomes convinced that the war in France is basically unwinnable, and so eventually he's captured and ransoms himself with the help of Alice Chaucer, who he later marries, who was the widow of the Earl of Salisbury's widow. And so William comes back to England and starts working for peace, and he becomes a confidant of Henry VI, who was, of course, a young king. And sort of history repeats itself. You have Richard II with the favourite Michael de la Pole, and now you've got Henry VI with William de la Pole as his favourite. And William de la Pole draws exactly the same flag as Michael, the second Earl did, and the first Earl, sorry. And so William de la Pole is a towering figure in Lancastrian politics because he takes the blame, along with the Beauforts, for losing the English possessions in France. And the de la Pole family, well, Michael again is impeached, and but before he is sentenced to death, he flees abroad. But then his ship is waylaid by a privateer called Nicholas of the Tower, and they have a kangaroo court. The William's ship is boarded. There's a kangaroo court. William's sentenced to death, and they shove him in a rowing boat and row him a little way, and his head is smitten off, and his headless corpse is washed up on a beach near Dover. So the de la Pole family are now, having been, so William managed to make himself Duke of Suffolk. So his son, John de la Pole, becomes the second Duke of Suffolk because his father was murdered, not executed for treason. So John was allowed to inherit.
I think I'll just... you mentioned just earlier that this is a bit of an oversimplification. And I suppose the really good thing with that is that you've written a book now, so you can obviously tell people that it's far more to look at in detail. But essentially, what you've discussed there is a family that's risen from relative obscurity, from Hull, from Yorkshire, and they've been able to essentially become new money, and with new money, being able to impose themselves onto the political arena. And this might just be the Welsh working class in me, but I always find it quite distasteful how much snobbery there is when we talk about some of these families, even today. Like, sure, back in the 15th century, a lot of the old blood would find some of the upstarts quite frustrating. But for some reason, people today who read and write about this period, they themselves also find it quite... How dare these de la Poles come in and become part of the ruling elite? But why not? They had made their money. They had made themselves nationally prominent. And across the generations, they clearly had something to offer. I mean, as you say, in the case of one of the many Michael de Poles, one of them died at Agincourt.
Yeah, exactly. And the articles of impeachment for William, still exist, and there's like 30 different charges leveled against it, and I think one of the major ones is he married John de la Pole, his son, as a babe in arms. He betrothed him to Margaret Beaufort, who is, of course, the mother of Henry Tudor eventually. And again, this is one of these ironies of history that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, would become the most implacable enemy of Richard and Edmund de la Pole, particularly Edmund. And yet their father was at one time married to Henry VII's mother, even though, of course, the marriage was annulled as soon as William fell from grace. And it was so they were betrothed in 1445 and married in 1450. So when they were 5-6 years old each.
And even that is really fascinating, and a lot of people don't appreciate the importance of that marriage in many ways, which of course didn't really go anywhere, because bringing it back to obviously my family that I study, the Beauforts, it's often mentioned the Beauforts have no claim to the throne, and everybody knew this. But nobody knew this because nobody ever commented on it in the 15th century. Richard III certainly never said the Beauforts were bad. And what we look at in 1450 is when your chap, William de la Pole, he has his downfall, he's arrested and, of course, murdered. One of the accusations levelled at him is that he's using the marriage of Margaret Beaufort to his son to try and put the de la Pole blood onto the throne of England. I'm sure that is complete nonsense. He had no ambitions to do that. But it's the fact that that was even mentioned in his downfall, that he was threatening to use the Beaufort blood, proves that the Beaufort claim obviously was known. And we could have had the House of de la Pole in an alternative timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, well, of course, and then it's Alice Chaucer does this remarkable flip from being part of the Lancastrian hierarchy. And of course, she was very close to Margaret of Anjou, which is Henry VI's wife. But as soon as William de la Pole's gone, poor Alice is out in the cold, literally, and she has to sort of fight to rebuild the family fortunes in the teeth of, as you say, aristocratic opposition who were absolutely wanted the de la Pole history, and but she then she waits until the time is right, but then she marries John to a daughter of Richard of York, Elizabeth, and she becomes the second Duchess of Suffolk. And so suddenly the de la Poles, from being these pillars of the Lancastrian court, are now part of the House of York. And this this of course, when Edward IV takes power, the de la Poles now are perfectly positioned to restore the family fortunes. And so John de la Pole, the second Duke, he had 11 children, of which John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, is the eldest. And even though it seems to me that John de la Pole wasn't particularly politically motivated, I think he'd sort of, seen his father murdered, and he had no desire to play this higher game. And so we don't hear a lot about them. John did fight at the Wars of the Roses, and I believe he may have fought at the Battle of Hexham, which is not too far from where I am. So that would have been, and I'd love to be able to prove that. And once the Wars of the Roses are over and Edward IV has established himself on the throne, that they do become pillars of the Yorkist court. And of course, they are nephews of Edward. John de la Pole's sons are nephews of Edward and nephews of Richard III. So this then becomes extremely important when Edward dies suddenly in 1483, and then of course we have the whole Edward V controversy.
We're not going there today. We're not going to the Prince Tower. No chance.
Phew.
Yeah.
So we'll leave that for another time. But what is important, I think, is that when Richard III does become king, and then his own child dies, Edward of Middleton, suddenly the de la Poles are next in line to the throne, and John being eldest, of course. Now he's never, as you probably know, he's never named as Richard's heir per se, but he's given a lot of the honours and distinctions that the heir to the throne would normally have, like President of the Council of the North, King's Lieutenant in Ireland, and there is I only saw this the other day, actually. I think there's a picture of John de la Pole's seal, the Earl of Lincoln's seal, I should say, that basically says, "I am the heir to the throne." And so John. Sorry,
Right,
Karen?
yeah, I was going to say, so let's just settle there for a second. So essentially what we've now got is this Lancastrian aligned family. John de la Pole, who becomes the Duke of Suffolk, he marries a daughter of the Duke of York. So therefore the
Yep.
allegiance comes very close into the rising House of York. We get to 1483 to 1485 period, and what we now have is you have a Richard III who is, to put it mildly, is coming under some strain as king.
Yep.
There are people out to bring him down. His son has died, and this means that it appears that he's next in line to succeed him as king, should Richard not have another child, is his nephew, John de la Pole. So suddenly this Lancastrian family have been reinvented across a generation or two into being the next in the line. I mean, the 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 parallels to the Tudors and to the Beauforts and other families like this are very obvious.
Yes.
How fortune's wheel is turning so quickly and bringing John de la Pole to the brink of being the next King of England. But of course,
Absolutely.
Bosworth happens.
Yeah, yes, what happened. And just a little aside to that, to show just how important de la Poles were to Richard III. He tries to arrange the John Earl of Lincoln's sister, Anne, a marriage to the Duke of Rothesay, who's the heir to the Scottish throne. So you know, he was building that, and as we know, Margaret Tudor ends up marrying the Scottish king. You know, that was the Tudor policy to make peace in borders through marriage. Well, Richard III was doing that way from 1484, I think it was. And so yeah, that they are incredibly important. And of course, we better just quickly mention the Earl of Warwick, who was the Duke of Clarence's son, who was older and had a better claim to the throne in many respects. Sorry, he was part of the older branch. But of course, he'd been barred from the throne by his father's attainder and execution. So yeah, I think the whole country did look towards the de la Poles as heirs in waiting, even if their claim to the throne wasn't necessarily as strong as it should be.
For the Earl of Warwick, I'd probably prefer the use of conveniently stepped over than official bard. I mean, it's legal fiction at the end of the day, isn't it? What these people are doing, back and forth. Okay, so I mean, my second question was actually going to be what's driven you to write a book about this family, but obviously there is a lot of drama to be found regarding this family. Richard III, he dies, gets bumped off, loses his horse, the rest of it. Henry VII, Henry Tudor, becomes King of England. We know that the father, John de la Pole, quickly reconciles to the new regime because
he does.
The king is the king. There's nothing much you can do. His son, John de la Pole II, the Earl of Lincoln, who has the Yorkist royal blood in his veins, he does initially reconcile, but something changes. It come the end of 1486, early 1487, he flees. And he comes back with an army led by a small boy they're claiming to be his cousin, the Earl of Warwick. John de la Pole, well, I think the quote goes by Polydore Virgil. He decided to try the fortunes of war. And of course, he would try and do that because Henry Tudor tried the fortunes of war and become king. But Warwick gets to Stokefield. He faces the king's army. And what happens?
The ditches run red with blood. And I think there's one of the contemporary sources says that the corpses of the Simnel rebels were so stuck full of arrows they resembled porcupines. And one of them was the Earl of Lincoln, and the royalist troops just made mincemeat of the rebels. Even though they had a strong army.
I mean, like much of history, it's obviously a matter of interpretation, and you're not going to know this answer any more than I do or anyone else does. But what's your gut feelings on what John de la Pole was up to? Do you think he was making a move for the throne himself? Do you think he was hoping to get, because again, this is interpretation, but I believe the boy at Stokefield was just who they said he was, an imposter. Do you think his plan is to switch it for Warwick and then he becomes the power behind the throne? What's your gut feelings on John de la Pole?
Yeah. No, I do think he was trying to give it to the throne. I think he saw Henry VII take power relatively easily, as you say, with a small army, and he thought, I could do the same. And so he obviously goes to see Margaret of Burgundy, which is his aunt, and I think Margaret was convinced that Simnel was her nephew escaped from the tower, and she, again, this is all conjecture. So this isn't in the book. This is my pure personal, as you say, gut feeling. But Margaret perhaps persuaded him. No, this is your cousin. You must support him. And no doubt, Lincoln thought, well, my grandfather William was the power behind Henry VI, and my great grandfather and great great grandfather were all to the throne. And then I think it was the phrase of the stalking horse. He was going to use Simnel as the stalking horse, and then if perhaps he did actually make it as far as defeating Henry VII at Stokefield, then who knows what would have happened. I think Lincoln would definitely have announced that no, this boy's an imposter. I'm the true heir, because that's how he's been brought up ever since the death of Edward of Middleton.
And of course, by 1485, both the House of York and the House of Tudor had become royal by the crown coming through a female line. So it's no longer a problem for John de la Pole that he's descended from the House of York through his mother, not his father. It doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. Yes. And so that he cannot be criticised for that, because obviously Henry Tudor was making the same claims. So yeah, and sometimes I think if Lincoln had actually sort of come clean right from the start and said, I am Richard III's nephew. I have a strong claim to the throne.
I have a theory on that, because it's one of the things that gets levied a lot, saying that John de la Pole must have believed Lambert Simnel was truly royal. Otherwise, why would he be subservient to this boy? And my answer to that is, and again, it's just a theory, it's just interpretation. My answer to that is, if you look at the evidence, there's a lot of evidence that suggests the Warwick name was potent. When people wanted to rebel against Henry Tudor, it was all about the Warwick name and the Warwick inheritance. Not necessarily about Warwick the boy, what type of boy he was. He's just an idea, Warwick. I think John de la Pole could not at that moment over that, because the Warwick name that the Warwick name accounted for. I think he had to bide his time. He couldn't be seen to be usurping right. But I could say it's all conjecture, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it is. It's speculation, and it's absolutely fascinating. What ifs can never be properly answered. But yeah, I think you're right. The Warwick name was incredibly powerful, throughout the country, and they had estates in the north, had estates in the south. The Kingmaker, Richard Neville, he cut a sway through the politics of the Wars of the Roses, and it was at St Albans. They ran through the streets. The battle cry was "A Warwick, a Warwick," and he was very much the hero. And I think you're right. That mythology is very, very potent.
And it's the reason why young Warwick eventually gets his head chopped off, because the Spanish are concerned. Yeah. They're concerned by the name Warwick. They don't want another Kingmaker. Anyway, so John de la Pole, he's unsuccessful. He loses the battle, and he gets killed during the battle. And the family story is somewhat quieter for the next couple of years. The de la Pole inheritance shifts to his next brother, Edmund de la Pole. Now,
Yeah.
Edmund de la Pole seems to play things fairly straight over the next few years, but eventually he becomes disaffected and he leaves Henry Tudor, Henry VII's side. So give us a bit of a picture of what's going on with this next brother.
So certainly Henry VII, he, after Lincoln's death, he was sort of posthumously attainted, and a lot of obviously all the lands that Lincoln owned under his own right were seized by the crown, as you would expect. But Henry VII, he also helped himself to some of the de la Pole inheritance that didn't actually belong to Lincoln. They would only have come to Lincoln once the father, the Duke of Suffolk, had died. So the family is basically impoverished. And again, I'm fairly sure Henry VII did this deliberately so the family didn't have the financial wherewithal. I mean, Suffolk was never a wealthy dukedom at all, but to strip them back down to reduce them financially. And also, he seizes a very important manor called the Manor of Kurdistan, which attaches certain feudal honours about holding the golden sceptre at the coronation. So it's sort of ceremonial that he takes that manor away from the de la Poles to say, you are not royal. You are just, you're in the background. But and Edmund seems to accept this. He's a typical noble youth of the day. He likes drinking and carousing in the dives of Eastern, and he's a very keen jouster. He spends a lot of the time, and he's gradually humbled by Henry. And the most egregious humiliation, I think, is when he's demoted to Earl, because he no longer had the financial wherewithal to maintain the status of a Duke. That's what the act of demotion actually says. But of course, the irony is that the reason why he doesn't have any money is because Henry VII has actually pocketed a lot of it.
This is a philosophy. This is a strategy still in use today in the American mafia. If you're not earning, they break you down a rank, and it's humiliating. And it normally signals you're probably heading for death. And it just shows that, the medieval monarchy is still mafiosos at the end of the day.
Yeah, they're absolutely. Yes, the parallels with the Roaring Twenties, but absolutely. And so Edmund, I mean, even he's sent off to Oxford in the time of Edward IV, actually. And Edward IV, bless him, he wanted to establish a new college of theology in Oxford, and where the study of the theology had been neglected for many years, apparently. So Edmund was going to be the poster boy for this new college, and there's a couple of letters from his tutor. And bear in mind that Edmund is only sort of 9 years old when he's sent off to Oxford. But this tutor writes in effusive language, saying, "Oh, he's marvelous. He gets on well with all his students, all the rest of it, and he's and we're so grateful that Your Highness could actually deign to send your nephew to us. And by the way, we need some more money to establish this college." So, but if you then read Edmund's letters that he wrote in later life, I mean, even allowing for the fact that Tudor spelling's all over the place, but they're barely literate, and I think he was far more, I think, the American jock rather than an intellectual. And yet, so as soon as as soon as Bosworth happens and all that, he's taken away from Oxford and is brought up for the military lifestyle that you would expect a young. And but he does, and whilst a young man, he fights for Henry Tudor on several occasions, and there's he taking part in the Cornish Rebellion of 1497, and also at the Siege of Boulogne in 1492, which was Henry trying to persuade the French king to end his support for Perkin Warbeck. So, and there's some evidence that Edmund may have been at another campaign in Flanders, at the siege of Dixmude, and so again, there's absolutely no indication whatsoever that Edmund wishes to rebel in the way that his son John did. Either the De la Poles had learned their lesson, or Edmund just simply didn't have political nous or ambition to follow in his brother's footsteps.
Well, I suppose what obviously ultimately changes is after 1499, Warwick is executed. He is, by any stretch of the imagination, the Yorkist heir. He is gone.
Yeah.
He's removed. The De la Poles keep on being provoked by Henry VII, and the time comes for him to start acting up, I guess.
Yes, and again, it's obviously it's dangerous to read too much into situations, but one of the flashpoints in Edmund's career is around this time. He's accused of murder, and on a drunken night out, he's confronted by he and his friends are confronted by a gang of East End toughs, and swords are drawn, blood is spilt, and a guy lies dead in the gutter. And Edmund is blamed for this, and he's actually arrested the next day, and sort of dragged out of bed by Reynold Bray, one of Henry's closest supporters, who's come in person. He hasn't sent his minion. Bray comes in person to arrest Edmund. And you could easily imagine that this was a frame-up. So either the dead guy was called Thomas Crewe. So either Crewe had been sort of paid to, ambush and kill Edmund to make it look like a drunken brawl, and ended up on the losing side, or if Edmund killed Crewe, which in fact is what happened, then Henry could actually use the full weight of the law to further undermine the De la Pole reputation, saying, well, look, this guy, this is not a king. This is a guy who balls in the streets and kills commoners. But on the other side of the coin, these brawls happened all the time. And there were several members of Henry's court who'd also killed commoners and had gotten away with it. So there was a Breton knight whose name escapes me that done exactly the same thing. But Edmund was hauled through the courts, and he was sort of tipped the wink that don't worry, you'll get off, but you have to go into court and plead guilty and then beg the king for a pardon. And this was too much for Edmund. I think Edward Hall described him as a man rash and heady, and so he literally he flees England. He goes abroad, and you rather get the impression that Henry VII had counted on this, but he thought that Edmund would actually comply, and suddenly Henry is threatened to a panic because he thinks, oh my God, he's going to go straight to Burgundy, and I'm going to have another Lincoln Signal episode on my hands all over again. But Edmund doesn't do this. He actually goes to Guy, to a family friend, for want of a better phrase, Sir James, who will be familiar to a lot of students of Shakespeare, if nothing else, as the guy who's supposed to have organised the murder of the princes in the Tower. And as you say, let's not go there. But this is where Edmund goes into this nice, safe castle of Guy, which is, of course, one of the two fortresses protecting the Calais Pale. And Tyrrell is actually a bit sort of unnerved that Edmund has shown up at this castle, because he's made his peace with him, even though, as we well know, James Tyrrell was a close confidant to Richard III. He's made his peace with Henry, and he's got this nice, comfortable sinecure as captain of the castle. And suddenly, trouble arrives on his doorstep. So he doesn't. Edmund is sort of. I think he's politely moved on. Is what we should say. And he then goes to Saint-Omer, which is just over the border in actually Flanders, which was Holy Roman Empire territory. But Henry's in his flat spin, and he sends two of his top courtiers, Sir Richard Guildford, to try and winkle Edmund now to bring him back home, and they actually go to the imperial court in Brussels, try and persuade the Archduke of Burgundy, Philip, to hand Edmund over. But the Philip said, well, actually, he's not here. He's in St. Omer. And said, well, no, oh, God, right, okay. So they rushed down to St. Omer with Philip's warrant saying that, he's persona non grata. And Edmund does come back in this occasion. And the murder charge is sort of all quietly hushed up, and everything's all sort of peaceful again. But incredibly, Henry still seems to want to keep Edmund under the thumb at every opportunity. And the second and final flashpoint comes when the same Philip Archduke of Burgundy is invited to a summit conference in Calais, and Henry insists that all the De la Pole surviving males attend this summit conference as part of this. A bit like the Henry VIII and the Field of the Cloth of Gold, 20 years later. This Henry VII wants to put on this huge display of the Tudor pomp and ceremony. All the nobles of England arrayed at a huge banquet for Philip. The De la Pole are made to go, and Richard's there, Edmund's there. And then the Capitol, Henry says is going to have a joust. It's going to have a massive tournament to celebrate the betrothal of Catherine of Aragon, who, of course, was Philip's sister-in-law, because he's married to Joanna of Castile, who was Catherine of Aragon's sister. But of course, she's betrothed to Arthur. And they're going to have and Edmund is going to lead. He's going to be the chief of the challengers. And of course, like everything Henry does to chivalry, this is all laden with symbolism. And years 1494 earlier, there'd been a very similar tournament when the future Henry VIII, who was only 3 years old, was made Duke of York, which of course has huge resonance for the De la Pole. And Edmund took part in this. He was the leader of the challengers, who was supposed to challenge Henry VIII's future Henry VIII's right to inherit dukedom, and then the Archduke would then defend Henry's honour and this sort of thing. And it was we have a very vivid description of this tournament. It goes into great detail and how Edmund rode into the tournament, with his bridle was dripping in gold spangles, and he had a massive silk canopy with his coat of arms embroidered on it, and apparently Edmund was extremely good at the tournament, and his principal opponent was Portugal's Sir Burrows, who he beat about the head and body with 22 strokes. And the poor Edward, he actually got a bit befuddled after that and had to resign his seat in Parliament because he couldn't follow what was going on. But again, it's the symbolism of how at one point in the tournament, Edmund is wearing the old murrey and blue livery of the House of York, and he's supposed to basically lose, to show the supremacy of the Tudors and this sort of thing. So anyway, so fast forward, so Edmund suddenly realizes there's going to be another one of these tournaments, and of course, if Arthur and Catherine get married and have children, then he's going to be moved further away from the throne because the Tudors will be, securing the succession. So, and then at this point we have a shadowy figure called Sir Robert Curzon enters the scene, and it could be that, as I say, Curzon may or may not have been a Tudor agent. The jury's very much out, but Curzon whispers in Edmund's ear, actually, I know the Holy Roman Emperor. I've been at the Imperial Court for a year, and I've been talking to him about the Yorkist cause, and he's right behind us. If you defect to the Imperial Party, they'll back a Yorkist invasion, just as they'd done with Lincoln 3 years earlier. So at this point, Edmund says, well, he agrees, and he flees England for a second time, and with Curzon, but this time he also takes his brother Richard and their servant Sir Thomas Killingworth, and they flee abroad. And there's again they try and have an audience with the Holy Roman Emperor, who leads them an absolute merry dance through the Alps because he's on holiday. This is the summer. And Maximilian I, he's goes every time Edmund and Richard in Killingworth and land in a village. There's a letter waiting for them. Say, "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry, but the imperial parties, the hunting here wasn't very good, or the inn wasn't up to imperial standards. So we moved on to the next village." So say they spend 3 weeks chasing the imperial party around Innsbruck and surrounding area. But eventually they are granted an audience, and sure enough, Maximilian says, "Yes, if I have but one of Edward's blood in my power, I will not rest. I will spend every crown I have to ensure he succeeds to the throne of England." And
Well, I think it's very important there just to restate and re-emphasize Maximilian's entire role throughout this period in being agent provocateur, meddling monarch that he is, in trying to stabilize and bring down the Tudor regime, because this is a key component in the entire political scene of the 1490s. It's Maximilian's deep and abiding hatred of Henry Tudor, which all stems from Henry turning his back on Maximilian in 1492 when they were supposed to invade France together, and Henry very quickly reaches an agreement with the French. From 1492 onwards until 1509, Maximilian never stops trying to bring Henry Tudor down, and that is associated, of course, with his support for Perkin Warbeck. It's now associated with his support for the De La Poles. What people don't often take into account is that Maximilian himself was descended from the House of Lancaster. So he also had his own claim to the English throne. All of this European context is very important. Nobody's acting in isolation. Everything's connected to everything. And people, I think this is obviously something that's big with Perkin Warbeck and the Prince in the Tower. People are clinging on to individual pieces of evidence and not placing it in its context. And this is the same thing with the De La Poles. They are being manipulated by Maximilian for his own agenda. It's not about who's got the best claim. It's not about who's got the right. It's about what can I get for me. And De La Pole is now suddenly beginning to be transformed as Maximilian's latest toy to play with.
Absolutely. And Bacon, Francis Bacon, who described Maximilian is like an archer who sort of doesn't who draws the bow and never quite draws it fully and release. He gets distracted by something else. But as you say, it's Edmund de la Pole, very much the arrow in Maximilian's bow. And when he wants to threaten the Tudors, he pulls it back. And when actually relations warm, poor Edmund is shunted off into the wilderness again. And it's and as I say, it's all tied up, of course, with the Flanders trade as well. Because Henry keeps putting embargoes on. Of course, that's Philip, Maximilian's son, Philip the Archduke. So much his purview, and Philip keeps trying to make peace up to a point. He keeps trying to sort out these trade deals.
Yeah,
and Maximilian is having none of it because, as you say, he just wants to bring the Tudors down at every opportunity. And it's,
I mean, it is fascinating. People don't pay enough attention to the European context of what is going on during this period. Same as today. British politics, what's that famous saying, when America sneezes, Britain catches a cold? It's very similar to what's taking place back in the 15th century. Now, I'm conscious that we're running short on time. So obviously Edmund de la Pole, he's off in Europe. He's faffing about, trying to press his claim. Philip the Archduke gets shipwrecked in England, becomes a prisoner of Henry VII, and Henry VII basically leans on him, going back to the mafia analogy, leans on him like the mob would to sign away Edmund de la Pole's freedom. Edmund de la Pole is placed into the Tower of London, where he is when Henry VII dies.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he falls under the remit of Henry VIII. And, well, Henry VIII, he's not keeping heads on shoulders if he doesn't need to.
It's curious that, of course, Henry VII dies 1509, but Henry keeps Edmund alive for another 4 years. And Henry VII actually, in his will, says, advises his son that, the moment I breathe my last, I couldn't execute Henry because, I promised Philip of Burgundy that I wouldn't. I would spare his life, which I've done. But now, when I'm dead, you're not bound by this oath. So you can bump him off. No problem at all. And I strongly advise you to do that. But for reasons not entirely clear, that Henry doesn't do this. He keeps Edmund alive, perhaps as a bargaining chip.
Well, I'm just going to ask, where is Richard de la Pole at this time? Is he abroad?
Yes.
Right.
So Richard is when Edmund's extradited back to England. Richard flees to Hungary, and where his distant cousin was queen, and this is Anne of Wacandai. She'd married Vladislas II, and Richard had opened lines with communication with Anne as far back as 1504. We think just in case he needed a bolt hole, and lo and behold, in 1506 he did. So he said to Budapest, and it's typical in history. He arrives just as poor Anne breathes her last, and she dies in childbirth, or shortly afterwards. And so Richard is safe in Hungary, and there is. Sorry.
So essentially, what I believe is happening here, what I would interpret is that it's what Edward IV did with Henry VI. If Henry VII executes Edmund de la Pole, then the entire family focus and inheritance will shift to Richard, who will be emboldened. But whilst Richard's abroad and Edmund's in London, then you keep the heir alive. You string them along, keep them in power, and it completely disenfranchises the younger brother, which is why Edward IV never killed Henry VI until Henry VI's son was dead. Because why let the whole focus shift to the younger?
Yeah.
So essentially, I would imagine that's probably a big reason why Henry VII didn't have him executed. And then by the time Henry VIII does have him executed in, I think, 1513, well, Henry VIII is so comfortable on his throne. No one's challenging Henry VIII really come 1513. So what? Get rid of him, and we'll eventually get rid of the other brother as well.
And also, it's by this time, Richard, as I say, he sort of disappears from sight between 1506 and 1512. We don't hear much of it, but he suddenly pops up back on the scene in 1512 at the French court, and he's in charge of a division of the French army that's invading Navarre for reasons that I could go into for a shorter time, and the French have recognised Richard's claim to the throne, and this has set alarm bells ringing, I think, with Henry VIII. And also, Henry is planning his own invasion of France, and so he's got an excuse to kill Edmund because his brother has assumed, as you say yourself, Richard has now assumed the White Rose mantle. He's calling himself the White Rose. He's calling himself Duke of Suffolk.
Very subtle.
And he's thrown in. Yeah, quite. So, as you say, the claim has already passed to Richard. So he's quite. So Edmund is now irrelevant almost, and as saying, Henry wants to invade France. He doesn't want to leave a Yorkist in London whilst he's away, because he fully intends to lead the army in person. and this is the attack on Tournai and Terouanne. And so he does. He orders Edmund's execution. It's all done, very quickly, very quietly. But his head is smitten off one May morning. I think. And of course, but there's a there's a slight aside that there is another brother, of course, in the Tower that everyone forgets about. This is William de la Pole, and he's a very odd figure because he again has the dubious distinction of being the Tower's longest-serving prisoner. He was arrested after Edmund's second flight to the continent, and he spends the next 37 years as a prisoner in the Tower of London. And he dies in 1539. And you would have thought that Henry VIII would have had him bumped off as well at the same time as Edmund, but for he doesn't. He just sort of just keeps him alive. And there's some argument over who was the older brother. Was William older than Richard, or Richard older than William? But it seems fairly clear that Richard was actually the youngest. So the claim had actually bypassed William de la Pole, but obviously he was in the Tower, so it makes practical sense that Richard was the only one who could do anything about it. But and Richard was by far the more astute diplomat and politician, if you like.
Obviously, we could probably do an entire chat on Richard de la Pole in himself. We are coming to the end. So what I would suggest is anyone who wants to find out what happens to Richard de la Pole and how he remains a scourge of the Tudor family for the next 10 years, you can obviously pick up the book, The Last Yorkists.
Yes, please.
All of the people we have been discussing in the last part of this talk, the brothers, those are the last Yorkists of your book title. That's who we are discussing about. This is who your book is focused on. What do you think is the de la Pole legacy? I mean, are there any de la Poles around still? Could we one day see a de la Pole resurgence taking down the House of Windsor?
Well, certainly Richard, he did have at least one legitimate daughter that we know about. And she became a ward of the French Queen, who eventually became Queen of Navarre, Marguerite. Who again, the whole library is written about Marguerite d'Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, because she's the first modern woman. She was very educated. She encouraged arts and sciences at a court, this sort of thing. But she also looked after the children of nobles who'd done service to the French royal house. And Marguerite de la Pole, and we have her marriage contract as survived, and she calls herself Marguerite de la Pole Suffolk. And she married a French nobleman from the southwest of France, and she becomes Marguerite d'Angoulême's lady-in-waiting when she goes to be Queen of Navarre. And her Marguerite de la Pole's descendants lived in the southwest, and they got involved in Protestant politics and the Huguenots in the 17th century. But they managed to survive all that, and there could easily be Marguerite's descendants living in southwest France, or Gascony, as perhaps we should call it. And obviously you're talking about an illegitimate daughter, so the strength of a royal claim might be a bit thin. But there are definitely old set.
You're a historical fiction writer as well as now a historical non-fiction writer. Come on, the plot is there for you to take up Marguerite's story and perhaps see where you can take it.
Absolutely.
It's probably really good. It's probably really good for her that. I'm going to be on Wikipedia after this, and obviously I've read your book. I've got the final chapter where you do have a good epilogue on Marguerite. But I'm going to try and see where that bloodline went. It's good for her, like I say, that she perhaps wasn't that prominent comparatively, because English kings have got a history for sending assassins over to France. In 1378, there was a Welsh claimant to the Prince of Wales title called Owain Lawgoch. And he was born in England. He grew up in France, but he was the last direct male line heir of the old princes of Wales. and the English king sent an assassin over to knife him in the guts. So I think it's very clever, maybe for Marguerite to have not made too much of a claim to a family's legacy. Although calling herself De La Pole Suffolk she may have called herself the White Rose as well.
Well, yes, she could have done easily. Yes, La Blanche Rose. Yes, that would have been fantastic. But no. So I'd love to know more about Marguerite. I think no, she and her descendants, as you say, they're worth a book in themselves.
Well, look, I appreciate you do end the book with her story. You know, she is the last Yorkist, perhaps in some way.
Yes,
you know.
Yeah, and perhaps we should just have a little bit of a footnote about Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who was the brother of the Earl of Warwick, and she, I suppose, she's technically the last of the Plantagenet Yorkists, if you like, and and of course, her execution is one of the greatest crimes in English legal history in many respects. Absolute farce and total disgrace. But yes, she and then her son. I'm getting outside my own field now. But they weren't really related. The Poles and the De La Poles. There were sort of distant cousins, obviously through the Clarence Warwick connection. But there's certainly some of the French sources do confuse the two, and they have the Countess of Salisbury as Richard and the Pole's sister. But no, they're certainly not close.
I think it's one of the great unfortunate realities of this subject that De La Pole and Poole, the names are so similar. It's very complex, very confusing for people to get the grip to. I mean, I sometimes mix them up on, which one's which. But thankfully, the De La Pole family now do have their biographer. We do have a good public history that we can now read. Like all good public history, your book is accessible, it's vivid, it's colourful, it tells a good story. And it certainly is a very good story. So it's probably time to bring this to a close. There are more than 100 people watching. I would implore you all to please go and consider ordering a copy of Richard's brand new book, which came out today. It certainly is a worthy read. And like anything, we just need to keep on putting more and more building blocks towards our knowledge to hopefully one day build up a fuller picture. But the house never finishes, I guess, when it comes to history.
Well, just thank you so much. I hope I haven't talked too much, but yes, no, they are a fascinating family, and I hope I've done their story justice.
Fantastic. Well, Richard Anderton, thank you very much. I hope to see you again soon. And thank you to everybody who has joined this talk and listened to us discuss a very fascinating part of Tudor history. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now.